Greetings, class. I'm here to talk about the Vincent Parrillo essay. I've taught a lot of classes on prejudice, and this is one of my favorite essays because it's very clinical and logical, and generally essays about this are very emotional. So it's a very unique essay. And I think to begin, we have to start to question, what does the word prejudice mean? And if you break it down, prejudice means to prejudge. And what that means is you judge people without knowing them. So for example, maybe the very first day of class, you see a person with glasses and you judge them. You say, you know what, I'm going to sit next to them because I think they're smart. You don't know if they're smart, but you're judging them. And we do it all the time. You might question, where does prejudice come from? It comes from our family, primarily. It comes from our schools. It comes from the news we watch, to the media. It comes from a variety of sources. You might even say that the moment we're born, we begin to become prejudiced because we start to look at the world in terms of what's safe for us and what's dangerous. So we start judging at a very early age. And another argument I like is this. It goes that we are all prejudiced. And I know that's a strange way to think, but there's a museum in Los Angeles. It's called the Museum of Tolerance. And they have two doors in that museum. One door says you are prejudiced, and one door says you're not prejudiced. And I tried to walk through the door that says you are not prejudiced, and I couldn't get through it. I was forced to walk through the door that said I am prejudiced, and it made me think, and you know what? We are all prejudiced. We all judge all the time. We size people up. We rate people constantly. We're doing this all the time. And Vincent Parrillo has a very interesting take on it. He actually has a very clever hook, very simple, but he basically starts by saying prejudicial attitudes may be either positive or negative, which is a very fascinating idea because generally when you think about prejudice, you look at it being negative. But he says that it could be positive. So to clarify this, positive prejudice will work like this. Negative prejudice is looking down on somebody. I'm going to avoid somebody because I don't like the way they look, right? So I'm going to avoid them. I'm looking down on them. Positive prejudice is looking up at somebody. So going back to that example, the very first day of class, you sit next to somebody because you think they look smart. And you're like, I'm not good at writing. I'm going to sit next to this person and they're going to help me with these essays. They're going to help me. And I can rely on them. That'd be positive prejudice. Or another version is somebody you don't know asks you for money, and you look at them and you say, you look like a very positive person, you look like an honest person, you look like somebody who can pay me back, so here's $20. That would be positive prejudice. And I really question this. I really question if prejudice could be positive or negative, because if you're judging people without getting to know them, that seems like a very negative endeavor. And so, because what if you sit next to that person and they're not smart? What if they're asking you for help on your essay? And I think that could lead to a very negative experience. Or what if you lend money to that person and they don't pay you back? And now you have a negative outlook on that person. So I really have a hard time with this. And I would love to hear what you guys have to say about positive prejudice. I guess another example would be survival. So you're walking down the street, you see a motorcycle gang, these big guys, and they're scary looking. And you decide these guys are scary. I'm going to walk across the street to protect myself, right? And so that might be a positive prejudice because you're protecting yourself. You're trying to survive. But I still question that as well, because what if those are really nice guys? What if they were just at a fundraiser raising money to help children? What if you go for a job the next day and you're going for an interview, and across the desk is one of the people in that motorcycle gang, and he said, you know what, you look familiar. You walked across the street last night. And I know these are all theoretical, right? But I really question whether or not the idea of prejudice could be positive. So with that being said, he says there are three types of prejudice. Going on from this idea, he starts his essay by saying prejudice can be positive or negative, and then he goes into levels of prejudice. And one of his levels of prejudice, he talks about cognitive level of prejudice, and that's encompassed by beliefs. And a lot of times we become prejudiced based off one experience. So maybe we're playing soccer, and we're playing with all these short people, and they start kicking us. And from that day forward, we just assume that all short people are mean and they're violent, and that's not true. But we often create our prejudice from one experience. But what he's saying is that there's a cognitive level of prejudice, and I have a hard time with that because when I think of cognitive, I think logical. I think it's very logical, and I have a hard time seeing prejudice being logical, having a mathematical formula to prove. Because prejudice is based off your emotions, it's based off fear, it's based off anger, it's based off past experiences. So I really have a hard time with that. I really have a hard time thinking about whether or not prejudice could be cognitive or logical. I very much disagree with that idea. But his next step is emotional prejudice, and that one makes perfect sense to me. I think prejudice is an emotional endeavor. I think we're afraid of people, we're angry with people, we want something from somebody, so we have these emotional drives that cause our prejudice. And then his last level is action-oriented prejudice. And that's where your prejudice becomes so high that you take action. You start to take action. So that's where you take action and you sit next to that person because you think they're smart. Or you walk across the street because you think that person is dangerous. Couple other key points from this essay. He talks about self-justification. And self-justification is you have the right to put somebody down because this is such a sensitive topic, but you have the right to put somebody down because you're helping them, or you're helping the betterment of the country. And I don't want to get into too many examples of that because they're everywhere in our country right now. But I did show a film that does show some self-justification. I provided a film that shows some elements of that. In that movie, The Minutemen, the first 18 minutes I had you guys watch it, there's one part of the film where I think his name is Chris Simcox, and he says, I'm out here saving lives, I'm saving lives. And so he says he's self-justified in getting immigrants deported because he believes he's saving lives. So that would be one example of self-justification. On page 581, he also talks about something I find very interesting, authoritarian personality. And he says that most prejudice comes from having an authoritative parent. And I question that. On one level, it makes sense. If your parents are mean to you, then chances are you're going to grow up to be a mean person. I mean, let's be honest. But I mean, I have friends who had really mean parents and they grew up to be really nice people. And I had friends who grew up who had really nice parents and they grew up to be very mean people. So I question this. I question if that is the root of prejudice. But we do spend most of our time with our family. So if our family is mean, and by authoritarian, it doesn't necessarily be mean. It just means strict. Like you have strict curfews. You have to obey rules in your family and things like that. That's where prejudice comes from. And maybe you guys are too young for this, but I remember when I was younger, I grew up and I'd say, I'm never going to be like my mom and dad. I'm going to do everything I can to be the opposite of them. And then one day you wake up and you're like, I'm just like my mom and dad. I work so hard. So it's an interesting idea that prejudice comes from parents. I think it can come from a lot of different places, but I would just say that it's almost prejudice on his part to say that if you have authoritarian parents, then you're going to grow up to be prejudiced. Another key area to look at that's very, very important for us, this comes up a lot in our topic. He talks about frustration. It's on page 583, and frustration, it works like this, where you're angry at somebody else because you feel that they're getting something that you're not getting. And I think this comes into our topic of immigration a lot. And I'll have you look for that, but it's a big part of it. But one example of frustration, the upper class, they might be very angry at the lower class because they feel that the lower class is using the system. They're taking advantage of them. They're lazy. They're not working hard enough. They're just expecting things to come to them, right? So the upper class might be frustrated with the lower class, and the lower class might be frustrated with the upper class because they find out they're getting too many benefits, they're entitled, they're using the system. So I think frustration can go into multiple realms. And I think it gets into our topic with immigration because a lot of people I know that Americans get frustrated with immigrants, and I know that immigrants also get frustrated with Americans. So I think that's a key topic for us in terms of, it's a key term in our topic. And one of the last terms to look at is scapegoating. And scapegoating is It's where you blame something else for your problems. And it's a Jewish term. And what they would do is they would have a goat. And if they were fighting in their community, what they would do is rather than blaming each other, they would say, this goat is responsible for all our problems. So they would send this goat into the wilderness and they would assume that their problems would be gone. So they're blaming their problems not on themselves, but on something else. Does that make sense? And I think that also comes up in the topic of immigration. I did provide a very controversial film. It's called The Minutemen. And I believe that that film gets very much into our topic. Elements of racism that you would see in that film. So prejudice and racism are different. Prejudice is just judging. Racism is judging people on the race. And I think that that film does get racist, where you have that mother who's taking her children out to find undocumented immigrants. You have the guy, I think his name is Little Dog, who says a lot of racist things, especially when he's walking through the tunnel. And I want to be clear what racism is, because when you get into the topic of immigration, racism does come up. And I want to be clear that racism is not logical, neither is prejudice. It's very emotional. And we have to be very cautious with this sensitive topic. And we want to abstain from having emotional arguments when we get into these topics. And what I was going to have you guys do is look for terms that you see in this essay that you would find in the Minutemen, and I can go over some with you. One would be action-oriented prejudice. These men are so angry with their country that they're taking action. They're patrolling their border because they feel their country's not doing enough. So that would be action-oriented prejudice. We already went over self-justification. Let's see. There's a lot of frustration with the government, with these immigrants who are coming here undocumented. You see a lot of that. You also see authoritarian personality. You have this mother who is teaching her children to not like these people at a very early age. And we don't know if she's an authoritarian per se, but I think it's fair to say that prejudice or racism is handed down from generation to generation. And one other thing I would mention about that film is this. I think near the end, near minute 18, I think this guy has a very valid argument. The rancher, where he's saying that I don't feel safe here. I don't feel safe checking the mail. They tear down my fences, and I have to pay money to fix them. And I think those are all very valid arguments. But I think once you get into the topic of, once the arguments start to get racist, it weakens our overall argument, I would say. And I guess one other thing to say would be this. It's kind of a counter, and we're going to be talking about counters more. But if they're that worried that these immigrants are gang members, then why are they taking their children to the border? Or why did this guy decide to move to this place? Because he wasn't there originally. So I question that, and I question the credibility of all of it as well. But I do like that part of the film because I think it matches up really, really well with our topic. And if you guys have any questions on this essay, you can email me. I think it's very important that if we get into the topic of immigration, we have to talk about prejudice and what it means. Thank you.